this guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 133 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, widely known, of course, as the mighty OGGO, the only committee that matters. We're very pleased to welcome back to OGGO Professor Clark and Mr. Boots. Back to OGGO. Start with Mr. Brock for 6 minutes, please. Go ahead, Mr. Brock.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to welcome both Professor Clark and Mr. Boots to the Government Operations Committee, also known as the mighty OGGO. So I'd like to frame my first round of questions to you that it's basically guided by two news articles that I was able to research. One from the National Post, written by Christopher Nardi, which I understand resulted in an interview between Mr. Nardi and both you, Ms. Clark, and Mr. Boots, as well as a policy option piece that both of you authored, dated February 16, 2024. But I guess I'll start by making an obvious assumption that the ArriveCan scam, debacle, however you want to frame it, certainly didn't come as a surprise to you. To you, Ms. Clark, Professor Clark, and to you, Mr. Boots. Would that be a fair statement to make?
Yeah, I think that was sort of the premise of the policy options article, was that this is something we should anticipate. Right.
And we all know what the Auditor General had to say about the whole situation. It was a clear picture of mismanagement around the app. She's guessing at the cost of the app, which we believe to be just shy of $60 million, could be much higher. But we don't have the proper documentation. The departments were so rushed and hurried to put together the app, they did not retain proper documentation. And I guess to you, Professor, and to you, Mr. Boots, that brought to mind the challenges of improper documentation that you found in your 2022 research paper. So the first question I put to you is, this is based on the policy options piece. You said that what could be done with respect to these findings? A response from the government is to simply add more rules, more oversight mechanisms, and more internal processes to prevent scandals. But following this age-old pattern will ensure that failures like ArriveCan and its IT scandal predecessor, Phoenix, continue. Can you elaborate on that for me, please?
Yeah, and this echoes a lot of what Mr. Boots offered in his opening remarks. There has been a tendency, I think, historically in the Government of Canada to layer on more rules and oversight to create new parliamentary officers, new kind of external scrutineers when there's some sort of a scandal. And while, of course, like, we're clearly not advocating for no rules, and in fact, you know, the research in clean, high-quality IT procurement focuses a lot on, like, what the guardrails should be and building a culture of responsible public service around that to avoid things like conflict of interest, for example. But I think that habit that we've had in Canadian public administration to layer on more rules as a way of ensuring accountability has actually had this perverse effect of undermining accountability and seriously undermining the effectiveness of public servants. So there's, you know, tons of examples that you can find. You know, a classic one that people love to talk about maybe 10 years ago was when the federal government first started using social media, and there were, you know, in some cases, these 20-step approval processes to release a 140-character tweet. You can also look to the Federal Field Notes website written by Paul Craig that Mr. Boots referenced to find some great examples of this sort of internal administrative burden. In one case, documentation required to publish a 5-page website basically was like, had more words than the entire edition of The Great Gatsby. So, like, we mire public servants in so much rules and compliance and the reporting burden, which is really well documented, not just in IT, but across the study of Canadian governance. And so it has two effects that are relevant to this question of IT contracting. One is it means when it makes sense to build in-house and to try to adopt kind of modern service design practices like user research, agile, multidisciplinary teams, public servants actually can't. It's like really difficult to do the right thing. We add so many rules that they can't be sort of nimble enough. So streamlining those rules would, I think, create space for public servants to do some more of this work internally. But the second piece of it is that when you have those rules in place, it actually becomes difficult for vendors in some cases to work in modern ways with the federal public service, because there are tight rules around things like project gating or the way that money flows, because they can't pull together a multidisciplinary team of internal public servants because HR rules don't allow it. So that's why I think the focus on kind of this latest spotlight on the problems of IT contracting should meaningfully lead to like a reset of policy, with a focus on kind of enabling good public service and focusing on what matters, which is like the conflict of interest and the, responsible bidding processes, not creating documentation burdens for public servants. That's not going to help. In fact, it'll make it worse.
Thank you for that thorough response. Mr. Boots, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, if I could just build on Professor Clark's remarks, I think the pattern that you see in a lot of public sector IT work is, if you imagine a large project that has 100 public servants working on it, 90 of them will be writing Word documents that are, project management, oversight compliance reports, all sorts of things that are not actually building the software. If you've got 100 people and only maybe 5 of them are actually writing software code, configuring systems, that's a really odd ratio that is very normal in public sector IT and just completely foreign if you worked at Shopify or Google or another mature tech company. And so trying to reduce those barriers that public servants face with oversight and compliance mechanisms that are really outdated means that you could spend less money having 90 people write meaningless Word documents and having more people actually build software code. And I think one of the sort of understated scandals of public sector IT is that it's very, very normal for the public service to undertake a $100 million IT project that could have been done for $10 million, or a $30 million IT project that could have been done for $2 million. And so this expectation that it's normal to have a $50 million IT project to build, an online forum or an interactive website that could have been done for a fraction of the cost. And there's some really great writing from Waldo Jaquith, who is a technologist in the United States, that talks about how software is so much cheaper. It's not free, but it's much, much cheaper than public sector organizations expect. But the tendency is to say, oh yeah, this project that's, is kind of similar to this previous project our department did. The last one was $50 million, so this one's probably $50 or $60 million, when a really strong team could have built it for $2 million. And that's something that is tricky to sort of dig into, because it all has to do with how public servants are doing the work of IT projects, where 90 out of 100 people are just writing Word documents instead of actually building.
I'm afraid I have to interrupt you because we're past our time.
Your study outlines a concerning picture of IT procurement practices within the federal government. You've mentioned that nearly a quarter of the $20 billion spent on IT contracts has gone to 3 firms. A quarter of $20 billion going to just 3 firms. Can you elaborate on how the government's failure to diversify its suppliers has led to higher costs and less innovation for the IT systems?
Yeah, I think that the kind of connection there is that for a whole bunch of reasons, certain firms are kind of have an incumbent advantage. Often, because the process is from the external, sort of from the perspective of those bidding for contracts, because there are so many hoops to jump through, it can be difficult for smaller firms to bid. So you end up in a case where you set up sort of the big firms to continue to get contracts. And so, why does that lead to lower quality outcomes? Is that the idea? Okay, I mean, part of it is just the basics of, not being able to force sort of competitive pressure against these vendors, because they're going to keep winning these contracts, whatever the outcomes, really. I mean, and it is remarkable how often, despite project failure or underperformance, these contracts might still be issued to those vendors. Part of that is we don't have a clear way of assessing what project success looks like. We don't have strong data on and proactively disclosed data on whether or not a project led to a good outcome. And that's something that we couldn't determine from our data. We can see how much we spent on contracts. We don't even know what was produced from that. And this is a really common phenomenon. In interviews I've done with U.S. public servants, the same conversation comes up, that there's sort of a small cluster of 3 to 5 big firms at any given time. And sometimes it switches who's in the lead, but roughly, 3 to 5 different firms. And they'll move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction delivering bad projects, and they keep getting hired, in part because no one's talking about it and no one's disclosing it in ways that make sense.
I want to pick up on two things there. The first is you talk about how larger companies seem to just perform better in terms of their success in achieving contracts. But we've heard that a company like KPMG, which is massive, was instructed by the public service to be a subcontractor to a firm that is objectively tiny. In GC Strategies, 2 people. So how is that possible when, for all of the reasons that you said, it's true that larger firms perform better? How do we end up in a situation where we're using a firm that doesn't add any value? Its supposed value is to source expertise, to source resources, but instead costs the taxpayers 30%, up to 30% more. But KPMG is a known commodity and is the heavy hitter in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I should really clarify. I think those big firms perform better in winning contracts, but they don't perform better in producing good services.
Yeah, 100%.
So that's that key to get it, to clarify. And I know you know that, but I just wanted to make sure I was being clear. How can something like GC Strategies arise? Like, I agree that it is, and all the information we've been learning is that it's surprising. It's not surprising, but it's shocking and concerning. I think part of it is just that we don't have that strong culture internally of scrutinizing value for money when it comes to these contracts. And there's a kind of, we're habituated to simply kind of trust, I think, that the firms that are winning the contracts are going to deliver. I think the Auditor General, in the case of ArriveCan in particular, also just highlighted basic breaches of responsible public service, right? So I think there's also that piece. And I will say that in interviews that I've done across a whole range of countries that are really leading in digital transformation, they are not worried about their relationship with vendors. They always say, we manage that because we have good internal rules, we have good organizational hygiene, we have sufficient IT expertise to hold them to account. So they would never fall for an a GC Strategies type scam because they put those conditions in place. And they also really always emphasize that these things happen in a culture of like strong ethics and values.
Very, very quickly, would you say that there is a correlation between the lack of accountability that we see and the diminishing role that ministerial accountability plays? The ministers are supposed to be responsible for their departments, but that seems less and less true all the time.
Oh, this is
Only time for a yes or no answer, I'm afraid.
Okay. It's complicated, but I love discussing ministerial accountability, so we should do this more.
Thanks. We'll now go to Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I join my colleagues in welcoming both of you back to committee. I know that you both have appeared, I believe, twice in November and then in November of 2022 and early January of 2023. And I just want to, recapture, I think, what we learned from you back then. I think we knew there was an issue when we put the Arrive scam issue on the agenda of this committee. But I think what I learned from you certainly is that government relies heavily on IT vendors and management consultants. And as you've stated again today, has done little to hire this expertise in-house and or train public servants. We also learned that it is hard to measure value for money or even how successfully completed a project is because of the ambiguous nature of how we collect data. And finally, that spending on external consultants is growing. And I think Mr. Boots has provided some great data in regards to that. Really quickly, you mentioned lucrative contracting opportunities for public servants. And so to you, Mr. Boots, as a former public servant, does all this contribute to public servants contracting with the government of Canada to do work that they should be...
Sorry, Mrs. Block, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Can you move your mic up a tiny bit?
Sure. Is that better?
Talk a bit more, please, and I'll let you know.
Okay, the question is, does all this contribute to public servants contracting?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
With the government of Canada to do work that they are already being paid to do in-house or should be paying to do in-house?
Thank you so much. I think it's a really interesting question. I would say off the bat that situations that we've seen in the news where public servants were simultaneously working for a department and then also running contracting companies, that was a huge surprise because I don't think that's a normal occurrence. But what does seem very normal is when you reach kind of like the mid to end state of your public service career in IT, it's very normal to go work for a large IT company, for a large IT vendor, because you have a lot of pre-existing relationships with your colleagues and counterparts. If you're a departmental chief information officer, you're probably never going to become an ADM, but you can make a lot of money going to go work for a large IT company, and you're all friends with all your other departmental CIOs that you used to work with. And so I think for those companies, it's very attractive for them to hire retired public servants who have a lot of pre-existing connections. And you see other things like large consulting firms running, demo days where they'll invite a lot of senior public servants to go see some cool things that new startups in Canada are doing, while they also gather a lot of notes on what they're then going to try to pitch back to departments to sell them some new management product or whatever, or IT product. So you do see those sorts of patterns. I think one way to fight that is to make it possible, like I mentioned earlier, to have a more successful long-term career that is sort of market competitive salaries while you're still in the public service. Because, of course, I have friends who have left the public service to go make triple their previous salary working for a large tech firm. And, of course, I left the federal government and I work for a provincial government. I'm still a public servant. I'm paid exactly the same as I was in my old job. And I'm very happy to sort of be able to play a role having a public impact. But for other people in different situations, it's very understandable that they go leave to make triple a salary. Like it's hard to say no to triple a 100,000 whatever salary, and that's an appealing thing. And that has consequences for this sort of somewhat cozy relationship that you see in news articles between the tech industry or like the sort of like this super large tech providers to government and the public service.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boots. Chair, I would like to use the rest of my time to move a motion that I put on notice last Friday, and I just want to read.
Let me interrupt for a sec. We're going to just distribute it to all the members right now. So go ahead, Mrs. Block.
I'll read it into the record. Given the government has spent $9 million of taxpayer money on a luxury condo located on Billionaires Row in New York City for the Consul General, the committee ordered Global Affairs Canada to produce a list within 14 days of this motion being adopted of all properties, including the addresses and listing prices of those that were visited or considered for purchase for the official residence of the Consulate General in New York. And the committee called the following witnesses to testify: Minister of Global Affairs, Melanie Joly; Consul General of Canada in New York, United States, Tom Clark; and the Deputy Minister of Global Affairs and other representatives from the department. And if I may just quickly speak to the motion that I've just read into the record, I think what has come to light over the past few years under this government's procurement practices is extremely disturbing, but perhaps not surprising. Whether it has been the hundreds of millions of dollars going to Liberal insiders or their friends at McKinsey getting special treatment in receiving government contracts, or former Liberal MPs and future Liberal leader hopefuls like Frank Baylis, whose company got a massive contract during the pandemic for ventilators that went unused, cost the government hundreds of millions of dollars only to be sold as scrap metal. We have seen the complete lack of spending controls on major procurements, including Arrive Scam. And every step along the way, this government has tried to cover up these consequences of their failed governance. We know that they voted against the audit of the Arrive Can app, swearing that there was nothing to find.
Mrs. Block, I'm afraid your connection is breaking up again. Maybe move your mic a tiny bit up, and we might have to ask you to finish up because, again, we're having troubles. Translators are having troubles hearing you.
Thank you. I'll continue and they can let me know if there's a problem.
And no, we're not able to hear you properly.
Well, that is extremely disappointing. I don't know what I can do from my end.
Yeah, unfortunately, the interpretation is not coming through at all, breaking up too much.
Thank you.
We're going to...
I'll move the motion.
Okay.
In general, I agree with this motion, but I would like to amend it in a few ways. We agree that $9 million for a New York condo for the Consul General needs to be examined. $9 million would make is a lifetime of work for the average person. That's a lot of money to be spent, so this certainly does need to be examined. In the context of a federal budget, it might seem like not very much money, but $9 million is actually quite a large sum. Here's the amendments that I would suggest. And those will be provided to you in the coming seconds if you haven't gotten them already. Given that the government spent $9 million of taxpayers' money to purchase an apartment in Manhattan, New York for the Consul General, the committee directs Global Affairs Canada to produce, within 14 days of the adoption of this motion, a list of all properties, including addresses and listing prices, that have been viewed or considered for purchase for the Consulate General's official residence in New York. And the committee calls the following witnesses to testify: the Consul General of Canada in New York, USA, Tom Clark; the Deputy Minister of Global Affairs and other departmental representatives; representatives from PSPC and the Treasury Board, as well as a panel of New York City real estate agents; and the Minister of Global Affairs, Melanie Joly, if the committee deems it necessary after hearing the other witnesses. And that these meetings be held between August 19th and August 27th, 2024 inclusively, and that apart from these 3 additional meetings, the committee hold no additional meetings before September 9th, 2024, with the exception of the 106.4 meetings and the meeting scheduled for today.
Mr. Brock and then Mr. Alhassi on the amendment.
Thank you, Chair. And at this juncture, the Conservatives will be voting in favor of the amendment. Owing to the technical difficulties experienced by my colleague, Ms. Block, and to complete the record, I wish to finish her thoughts. Whether it's their friends at McKinsey getting special treatment in receiving government contracts, or former Liberal MPs and future Liberal leader hopefuls like Frank Baylis, whose company got a massive contract during the pandemic for ventilators that went unused, cost the government hundreds of millions of dollars only to be sold as scrap metal. We've also seen the complete lack of spending controls on major procurements like the Arrive scam, an app that started with an $80,000 initial price tag, but ballooned to at least $60 million, according to the Auditor General. And every step along the way, this government has tried to cover up these consequences of their failed governance. They voted against the audit of the ArriveCan app, swearing that there was nothing to find. They swore there was nothing to find with the McKinsey contracting, yet each time malfeasance is found and has revealed a troubling pattern. Right before the House rose for the summer recess, it was reported that the government was purchasing a building right on Spark Street. No practical reason for purchasing this building was given in the articles, but they did note that, surprise, a good friend.
Sorry, Mr. Brock, we have a point of order. Mr. Jory?
My apologies, Chair. I believe we are debating the amendment to Ms. Vaniola's motion, and I'm trying to understand the relevance. I just want to follow, and if it's relevant, I'm sure you will allow it. If we need to go back and focus on the amendment, I really appreciate that direction from you.
Yeah. Mr. Jory does have a point. We are debating the amendment, not the original motion. Perhaps if you just stick with the amendment, please, sir.
But did note, surprise, surprise, a good friend of the Prime Minister, Michael Pitfield, had part ownership of that building. Again, Conservatives are voting in favor of the amendment. Of all the buildings they could have purchased in Ottawa, they happened to buy one that directly benefits a close friend of the Prime Minister. Again, Conservatives are voting for the amendment. Now in New York, one of Trudeau's handpicked diplomats...
Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Mr.
I think, Mr.
Alhassi?
Chair, you did point out correctly and accurately that this is about the amendment. So everything that the member is saying currently is irrelevant. Thank you.
He literally mentioned the amendment in the last 10 seconds.
I have. It's all irrelevant. I've got literally 30 seconds. If they want to continue to interrupt
They don't want
me,
to talk about Pitfield because Anna Ganey wants to
finish
be
up,
leader.
Mr. Brock, and
Right.
then we'll go
in
to
the
Mr.
race.
Alhassi.
Thank you. Of all the buildings they could have purchased in Ottawa, they happened to buy one that directly benefits a close friend of the Prime Minister. Now in New York, one of Trudeau's handpicked diplomats just got a big upgrade in his residence. Trudeau has found it prudent to purchase an apartment on Billionaires Row for $9 million. Again, Conservatives are voting in favor of the amendment. This is how Trudeau's chosen elite live high on the taxpayer's dime, at a time when Canadians are struggling to pay their mortgages or the rent. Again, Conservatives are voting in favor of the amendment. At a time when our country is seeing more tent cities cropping up across the country, at a time when 2 million plus Canadians are going to food banks to feed their families, and according to the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, more hurt is on the way with more defaults on the horizon as many Canadians are facing mortgage renewals over the next few years. Again, Conservatives are voting in favor of the amendment. Frankly, at a time when Canadians are living through housing hell, Trudeau is more interested in buying for and buying from his friends over delivering for Canadians. Conservatives believe that Canadians deserve answers, which is why Ms. Block brought forward this motion, which calls on the government. And I can't complete her thoughts on that, but that's my intervention. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Alhassi. Go ahead, sir.
I was just wondering if I could make some changes just to make sure that this committee can do its work properly. The first one would be.
Let me just interrupt you. You're proposing a sub-amendment, just to be clear?
Yes, correct.
Perfect. Go ahead,
Yes.
sir.
So I am proposing, first of all, just to refine it somewhat, that for the documents that have to be provided to the members, that we extend that from 14 days to 30 days. So that would be the first aspect of my sub-amendment. The second one, I understand that Ms. Vignola has proposed that we hear from relevant witnesses. That makes eminent sense. However, I was wondering if, in the interest of assisting the members, if all the members would agree to send in the names of those witnesses and for the deadline to be August 12th. So it would be adding relevant witnesses and submitting those witnesses by the members by the deadline of August 12th. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, speaking on the sub-amendment, we do have a rule, lack of better words, in the committee that amount of witnesses will be based on the percentage of the parties. So it's a pretty straightforward amendment there. The 12th seems pretty straightforward as well. But anyone wish to speak on the sub-amendment? The other issue that Mr. Alhassi's brought up is just the date of the documents. I see Mrs. Vignola.
I don't like to go on a fishing trip when I question a witness. I want to be able to base my reflections on something concrete, something I have analyzed. And if I don't have the documents before the first meeting, then the only thing I'll be able to do is go on a fishing trip and ask vague questions. Then I'll get documents after the fact and realize, oh, wow, the answers they gave were in the documents that I would have been able to read. I would have had better questions. So that would be a big waste of time, a waste of the witnesses' times, a waste of taxpayer money as well, because, of course, they're the ones who finance the work of this committee. I would not approve a 30-day deadline because I would need to read the documents before the committee meeting.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chair. I had an opportunity to listen to Ms. Vignola, and I certainly understand and appreciate full well her concern. However, I don't think it would make sense for us to run the possible risk of not providing the department ample opportunity within 14 days to provide those documents. So God forbid, should that not prove possible, we would find ourselves in a very precarious position. And I really do think 30 days would make more sense, because the 30 days would not run. We do run the 30 days prior to the next meeting of the committee, but that's just an observation on my part.
I understand where my colleague is coming from. I do try to compromise, and I like to find an arrangement that would satisfy everyone around the table. I also want to respect the realities of public servants and translators, so I would suggest a friendly amendment.
Je dirais de changer le 30 jours.
Instead of 30 days, I would suggest 21. This would be partway between the original amendment and the sub-amendment. What do you think?
Thanks. I'm seeing nods around, but I do have Mr. Barrett wishes to speak on the sub-amendment.
So the motion, so I have a question for clarification. I want to ensure that the proposal with respect to witnesses, it just needs to be clearly understood by everyone that this is in addition to the witnesses that are prescribed in the motion. I need to understand that this isn't replacing because we don't have the sub amendment in writing, that the sub amendment does not remove the named witnesses being the Consul General, the Deputy Minister named, the representatives from Supply Canada and Treasury Board, Minister of Global, and the Minister of Global Affairs. So those witnesses need to still be included. I need to understand if that's what we're voting on, and further, if the meetings are to be held between the 19th and the 27th, whatever the date is that is being proposed, 21, 15, that we need to have an assurance through you, Mr. Chair, from the House, that we're going to be able to have those documents translated for that first meeting of the committee. So that, to Ms. Vignola's original point, the documents need to be in our hands in both official languages prior to the opening of the window for these meetings to occur. And I need to just get some clarity that the named witnesses, in addition to the proposal for the submission of additional witnesses, that these witnesses remain, and that's in addition to those witnesses.
The first question on if we set 21 days is the 14th, I think it would be by, say, noon. We should, I don't think it's a lot of documents, but you never know. So I can't say with absolute certainty, but probable, because I cannot imagine it's a lot. And being summer, I don't think there's a lot of requests going into the Translation Bureau right now. So not a certainty. Your second question is, you have the same understanding as I do, but Mr. Sassi can chime in. It's just to provide the witnesses by X date, but it's not to replace these witnesses, but to provide for the parties to provide witnesses by the, I think he said the 12th.
By the 12th, so it provides a
but it's
date,
but it's not replacing witnesses noted in the. Was that your intent? Mr.
No, it wasn't. But to the best of my understanding, it currently reads other relevant witnesses submitted by members.
So it's not replacing.
No, it's not replacing.
Yeah. So are you clear on the second part about the witnesses? The receiving the documents in the translation, it's always difficult. Again, we can't guarantee it because I don't know how many documents are going to arrive. If 5,000 pages arrive, just to exaggerate, within 14 days, they're not going to get translated, whether we say 14 days or 21 days. But there's not a lot going in the Translation Bureau right now, so I think we probably should be fine with that.
We can assuming they're not taking vacation.
Yes, assuming they're taking vacation. So I would assume so, but nothing's a guarantee. and we wouldn't be able to guarantee if it was the 14th anyways. Or we wouldn't be able to guarantee if it was 31 days or 30 days, as which was originally proposed.
But it is for the 14th? Is that what we're saying now?
14th as opposed to 14 days.
Right. So we're saying
so the 14th, yes.
The 14th. Okay.
Yeah. I'm sensing we're okay with that. We cannot do it as a friendly amendment, but we can adopt it as a UC, Mrs. Vignola's suggestion. And just to be clear, I'll have the clerk read back what the sub-amendment will be, with bringing in Mr. Assasi's comments on the witness date and the date of the documents.
Which unit?
Just the sub-amendment.
So the sub-amendment is to replace after the words, or to add after the words, to produce within 21 days of the adoption of this motion, and after the other witnesses, that other relevant witnesses to be submitted by the parties by August 12th.
Straightforward, everyone's clear on that?
Yes.
Fine, so we'll consider the sub-amendment adopted. We will now go to back to the original amendment, which, if you recall, is
Amendment as amended.
the sub-amendment.
Sorry,
Yeah, so
original
we're now
motion
back
as
to the
amended.
original amendment from Mrs. Vignola, which adds the dates for the meetings and ends other meetings. Bear with me 2 seconds. So we're adding Mrs. Vignola's, so we've accepted the sub-amendment. We're back to the original amendment from Mrs. Vignola, which is, and that these meetings be held between August 19th and 27th, 24 inclusively. Apart from these additional meetings, committee hold no additional meetings before September 9th, with the exception of 106-4s. And then also changes, last line for the witnesses, the Minister of Global Affairs, Minister Jolie, if the committee deems necessary. So we're now back on that amendment. And I will go to Mr. McKinnon. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a concern that I'm not clear that the committee has the power to order, somebody to produce documents. I suspect that has to go to the House, and the House has to issue that order. I wonder if someone could clarify that. Perhaps the clerk could clarify that.
The committee does have the power to do that. I'm going to have the clerk repeat what I said, and you're welcome to, sir. But committees we've ordered, as members around this table know, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. But if you wish to confirm that for Mr. McKinnon, sir.
Yes, the committee is within the rights to request production of documents.
I'm sorry, Mr. Clerk, I couldn't hardly hear you.
So yes, the committee can request the production of documents. Order.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. In that case, I would like to propose a further sub-amendment. I believe that we should add to the documents we are requesting, we should request an independent third-party assessment of the value of the property that was purchased. And that would, I guess that language would be in the appropriate place in the motion, probably after the residents of the Consulate General in New York.
I'm going to interrupt you, Mr. McKinnon. Maybe we could just restart that, because the committee cannot order money spent for a creation of an independent. If you're looking for the existence of one, maybe you could narrow it down to that, but we can't order I'm
I'm suggesting that we need to see the value of this property that we purchased. And my suggestion is that we ask for the for an independent third-party assessment of the value of that property in that market.
Yeah, that's not something that we can, again, order the government to pay for and have done. If you're asking for, if there's an existing one, we can ask for those an existing documents, but we can't order the government to spend money to have a consultant. Maybe GC Strategies is available to do it, but we can't order that to be. Sorry, I had to. We can't order that to be done.
I'm not requesting. I'm not suggesting that we order them to spend money. I'm asking that there be I mean, there is very likely an estimate, or sorry, an assessment that was made as part of the purchase. But that's my amendment. My sub-amendment is that after the official residence of the Consul General in New York, including if available, an independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market.
Who are you? Sorry, I'll hand it over to Mr. Baer and then Mrs. Vignola. But just, I want you to clarify, Mr. McKinney, who are you proposing does this independent? Because the committee can't order, even if we pass a motion, we can't order the government to perform an independent audit. We can ask if there's evaluations of it, or we can ask if there was one done. We can ask for those papers, if that's what you're asking for.
The language that I just said is that, and include, if available, an independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market. That does not order the government to spend any money, but that is my sub-amendment.
So just to be clear, the sub-amendment to produce these documents if it exists.
If available is what I said. I think it's important that we understand the value of the property. This is not an expense.
If there was an independent one done, we can ask for it if it exists. Not if it's available. If it exists, we can order it, the production of it. How's that? Are we on the same wavelength now, Mr. McKinnon? Basically, if one was done, we'll order the production of it. Correct?
I'm going to say I don't really like you rewording my motion or my amendment, but I will reword it a little bit. I'll say to add after the purchase for the official residence of the Consul General in New York, comma, and request, if available, any third-party independent assessment of the value of the property in that market. That should deal with your concerns.
Bear with us 2 seconds, Mr. McKinnon. Just making sure our clerk has what you've been asking for, Mr. McKinnon, so everyone's clear. We're just going to read it back. The clerk's just going to read it back to Mr. McKinney. If you could let us know if we've collected it correctly from you.
So after New York, comma, add and request, if available, any independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market.
It's much more clear now. So if the government has carried out an analysis, we would like to have it.
Thanks, Mr. Barrett. Then Mr. Brock.
Well, I fundamentally disagree with Mr. McKinnon that this is not an expense. His words were that this $9 million is not an expense, that $9 million in a cost of living crisis, in a housing crisis in our country, $9 million on a condo for Justin Trudeau's buddy Tom Clark on Billionaire Row, that $9 million is not an expense. Well, was it a gift? Because if it, how did that purchase come to pass? I mean, just absolute fantasy along the lines of budgets balancing themselves. Of course, $9 million is an expense. And it was taken out of Canadians' pockets. It was taxed off of their paychecks. So, of course, $9 million is an expense. And I'm pleased that the chair did heavily coach the amendment, because in its current form, it's supportable, though it wasn't in its original form. But we want all of the information about this $9 million expense that taxpayers are footing for the luxury condo for Justin Trudeau's buddy, Tom Clark, living on, quote, Billionaire Row in New York City. And I hope Mr. Clark enjoys it until the day after the next election.
The concern that I have, if anyone, I'm sure we've all dabbled in real estate in our personal lives, if not professional lives. There's always a cost attached to any assessment of fair market value. No, I understand that, Chair. I just want to complete my thoughts. There's always a cost to obtain an assessment. So, in the ordinary course of events, the Liberal government, an agent of the Liberal government, would have negotiated the purchase of this extravagant, ultra-luxury penthouse on Billionaires Row for $9 million. There may or may not be an assessment that was made privy to the agent who purchased the property on behalf of the Government of Canada. But unless it's in the government's possession, even if one exists, the author of that assessment, unless they are a very generous individual or company, is highly unlikely to release it to the government to comply with this order without a cost. So unless the Liberal Party of Canada, which is in a position to pony up for a potential expenditure to comply with this particular order of committee, my concerns are it should not fall to the taxpayer.
Mr. McKinnon, is your hand up? Or is this just from the previous?
Yes, I just wanted to quibble about Mr. Barrett's comments. It's a purchase of a liquidatable asset. It is owned by the Government of Canada. It can be sold at some point, and presumably the value recaptured. It is definitely not an expense by any acceptable accounting process. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. And I also would suggest that we should ask or invite our witnesses to leave if they don't want to stay.
Well,
No.
maybe save that for your committee, Mr. McKinnon. I'm sensing we're getting close, so I'm hoping we might be able to get one more round in with the witnesses, because I want to hear more from them. Do we need to vote on Mr. McKinnon's sub-amendment? It sounds like, I think we're in a general agreement with basically providing those documents if they exist, as the clerk has read back.
We should send a green book over to his committee, too.
Yeah. Are we fine with that? Do we need to vote on it, or can we accept it as, I'm sensing we are accepting it. Unanimous consent. We are now back to the original, now amended motion. So we're back to the amendment. Do we need to, are we fine with this? Wonderful, that is accepted. So, and we're back now, the sub-amendment, amended motion. Are we fine with it, colleagues? Yes. Wonderful. I am glad we did not dismiss our witnesses. We are back to our speaking order. And no, I'm sincere, because I'm finding the time with Mr. Boots and Ms. Clark fascinating. So I'm very, very happy that we can have them for a bit longer. We're back to Mr. Barrett for 5, please.
So, Ms. Clark, when we left off, I had asked you about ministerial accountability, because we have seen a situation where situations like the Trudeau Liberals' Arrive scam saw companies like GC Strategies, a two-person operation working out of a basement, adding no value. Supposedly, they were to source. They were to source resources to work on the project, but we learned from KPMG, which is a huge company, that KPMG was instructed by the public service that they would need to be a subcontractor of GC Strategies, adding 30% to the cost of it, and there would be many of these cases. So, is the problem that no one is in charge anymore, and so there's no one actually trying to evaluate whether we're getting value from these contractors, big or small? Because as you said, though the larger companies are the most successful in winning the bids, they're not necessarily providing the best value for money. And value for money is a whole other conversation that we'll save for another day, because there are far too many cases where, as the Auditor General has noted, we don't get value for money with the Trudeau Liberals procurement process.
Mm-hmm. So I think like the point around holding ministers to account for these kinds of failures is really important, and something that we've seen in other jurisdictions where we've had massive change in thinking about how to work with vendors and how to manage digital initiatives more generally. It's usually because there's been a big political scandal and somebody's like was on the line, who, someone and was held to account, and there was a clear point of ministerial kind of ownership. This is a challenge in the Canadian case in that we have muddied ownership of all these questions, right? So you've got, first of all, many departments involved, like Public Services and Procurement Canada, Treasury Board. Now we have the Minister of Citizen Services, Shared Services, ESDC is an owner of many of these, so how do we, to move beyond just a specific question of what happened with Arrive Can, I mean, when there is a kind of an IT failure, it can be really hard to locate like who to blame, but also who's then sitting around the cabinet table feeling like I am responsible for and I own this. When we had a Minister of Digital Services in the past, we no longer have that role. I'm not sure that was necessarily the answer to this problem, but one thing that I think would be important to think about in sort of future machinery of government configurations is like, how do we create a clear locus of responsibility and accountability that is like answering questions in question period and actually can access the information they need to be responsible. Because this is, of course, the other challenge around ministerial accountability on this particular file is that their ownership is so distributed and the decisions are happening on so many different ways that it's really hard to know who would be reasonably blamed for these things.
Well, and they shuffle the deck chairs on the Titanic so often that it's hard to know whose seat is whose. They've had 4 PSPC ministers in 4 years, so it's really tough. They've created a situation intentionally to make it harder to hold individual ministers to account. And this Prime Minister has established a system where no one is held responsible in spite of their failures. He doesn't fire the ministers when they break ethics laws, and he doesn't fire them when they fail Canadians. There's a list of 2-person middlemen companies like GC Strategies, and there seems to be dozens of them. Solutions Moray Incorporated had 2 employees. They've got $78 million in contracts. Mesa Computing, 1 employee, $34 million. Mobile Resources Group, 1 employee, $28 million. Access Corporate Technologies, 2 employees. They got $9 million. Hackett Consulting, 1 employee, $8 million. They must have been really working overtime. What real value have they provided to Canadians for these hundreds of millions of dollars? Isn't it easy to say that they've provided no value?
I think I don't know what each of those firms has done. I haven't looked at the individual contracts or what their deliverables were, so I really can't comment on the value for money. But I will say, sort of looking to the patterns we saw in the data, that we have very good reason to believe that the kind of pooling of contracts in a small number of firms, and also the general practices around how we manage IT procurement suggests that there would not be value for many of the IT contracts that we're striking, just even at the basic level of how much money is going into each of those individual contracts.
Mr. Boots, Professor Clark, thank you sincerely so much for your time, your patience with us. I do encourage you, if you have any reports, any links that you wish to share, any documents, please send them in to the clerk. We'll get them translated and sent out to the members. I assure you they will be very welcomed. And we look forward to perhaps welcoming you back again when you have your report or your papers published. Thank you again sincerely. We are adjourned.